Welcome back to our watercolor techniques practice videos. This is part 3. In our part 2 video, we laid the groundwork for some future techniques that we're going to get to either in this video or in the next video. And we also completed some as well. We did the solid wash together, the graded wash. We laid the groundwork for glazing, which we have not gotten to part 2 of that yet. The wet on wet technique, our dropping of color on wet technique, both of these are completed. The dry brush technique, the negative painting, and the lifting feather out technique we still need to complete. We'll get to those later on. The taping technique and the magic eraser technique still also need to be completed. And I'm going to start with the taping techniques so that I don't forget to show you that. Here, I already removed the right hand piece of tape, so you can see that I have some white in the space where the tape was masking off my paint from attaching to the paper. So I'm going to go ahead and peel up my other layer of tape on the left so you can see the effect of that as well. So if I was going for a look of trees, I could have painted this brown first, masked over it, and then painted my green on top, which would have prevented the green from seeping into the brown and keeping that nice crisp edge there. And I'm actually pleasantly surprised with how the masking tape held up. I was expecting there to be some bleeding of the paint underneath into the white area that I wanted to keep white underneath, but actually it kept those nice crisp edges that I wanted, so that worked out really well. Today I have my watercolor paint with me. Again, this is just the typical generic Prang with 8 color wells. I have a cup of water. I have 2 brush options this time. Both of these are watercolor brushes, and we can tell from their very soft bristles. This is more of a rounded edge, and this is a flat edge on my brush. We're going to use both of these today. I also have my paper towels with me, which we're going to use to be wiping off our brush as we switch between colors. We're also going to be using it to pull color off our paper today. And I have this tool that we use in my classes for a scratch board technique. You're going to need something that you can use in, let's find where it is, the scratching wet versus dry box. And I'll talk more about that when we get there, but you're going to need something that you can scratch with. So a paper clip would also work as well. We're going to start towards the top here just so we can start filling some of these out, working from top to bottom. Scumbling is the first one that we're going to do today. I'm going to, again, activate my paint by wetting my paintbrush first and then transferring some of that water into my paint wells. I'm going to go with green on this one first. Now, scumbling is just going to be random motions with my brush. And this is good for foliage. If I wanted to create a look of a bush, or even this would work really well here on top of the tape effect if I was going for the tops of trees. So I'm really just making very random, almost dots or dabs of paint on my paper. And now if I wanted to make this more of a two-toned look or something where I'm blending colors together, I could switch and maybe use a brown as well and layer these. If I had a shadowed area, I could layer some of my darker color into that shadowed area. So you can see how this can kind of give us the illusion of foliage. So that's scumbling. The next one we're going to do is pushing out pigment. For this one, I'm going to switch and use my flat brush instead of my round brush. This is going to allow me to get a nice crisp edge on the bottom, and then I'm going to be almost flicking my wrist upwards and pushing that color up. I'm going to do blue for this one. So I'm switching to a new paint color here. I need to activate my paint with my water. Now I don't want a ton of water for this one. I want to get kind of like the dry brush look at the top. So I'm turning my paintbrush so that the bottom is parallel with the bottom edge of my box. I'm starting at the bottom here, and I want to kind of flick my wrist upwards, and I'm getting kind of that dry brush look at the top. So I'm going to do that again. Now with the right consistency of paint, something like this where we're getting this textured look on top could be used for a section of grass, or maybe sometimes fur, depending on how thick the fur is. But trying that, it's a little bit different than the dry brush technique, but it has a similar effect on the top and gives us a little bit of a look that is similar. And I'm going to try it over here with more water. The more water you have, the flatter this top part is going to be. So getting this look on top, we don't want a ton of water saturating our brush. The next one that we're going to try is wiping out. I'm going to use red for this one. I want to just create for myself a nice base color. I'm not using a ton of water here because I want it to be saturated with color. I don't want it to be very watered down so that I can see the effect of what I'm about to do. And I'm going to switch back now to my round brush instead of my flat brush. Getting all this extra green out of my round brush that I was using from before for scumbling. So I want this to be a clean brush. This has to be wet while I'm doing this. So I'm trying to pull some of the pigment off of my paper from the red. And I can do that two different ways. I'm going to try with my brush first. So I'm just using water here, no color. And you can see that just by applying some water, it is pulling some of that color up off of the page. And each time that I stop and pull some of this color off, I am removing that paint onto my paper towel on the right side over here. And you'll notice that the water from my base layer is going to want to start to kind of seep into where I have removed that color. So you'll find that if you want a very specific size section for this, then you might have to continue to lift until it gets bigger and bigger and that paint is not seeping into where you've removed paint from. I can also use a paper towel or a Kleenex, and this, if I'm just dabbing on my paper, could work well for something like clouds. So you'll see it's lifting that pigment off of the paper here as well. And this has already actually started to dry more than I wanted it to. So I'm gonna try this again by applying some more water and paint on the right, just so that I can do this while it's still wet. So you can see this a little bit better now. But if I was trying to make clouds in a sky, this is probably the route that I would go. I would be pulling some of this paint off of my paper from the background, and that would allow there to be more realism with being able to see some of the color behind, but not making it completely white. The detail painting box is just a place for you to try out different brush strokes and using your brush in different ways. So for instance, I'm going to switch to purple here. I can get very different effects by turning my brush in different ways. So I use the top part of my brush here. I can make very detailed marks. Depending on how much I press on my paper, I can get some very precise lines by not pressing very hard at all. Using the same brush stroke, I could then flatten my brush out and get something that's a lot thicker and then thin it back out. So practice with some different types of pressure. You can do the same with the flat brush head if you'd like. So it's testing out, you know, okay, I can get a pretty thin line here. I can go thick and then get thinner just by changing the direction of how I'm using my brush head. So practice with some different motions with your brush and also with different pressures as well. Being able to control your brush in this way will really help add fine details to any watercolor painting that you're trying to complete. And the last one that we're gonna try out in this video, I'm sorry, there's two more. So we have the hard versus soft edges and then the scratching wet versus dry. So we will do both of those. This one here is just to get you to notice the difference between a softer edge with the watercolor paint and more of a precise hard edge. So I'm gonna start off first by wetting my brush, and I know that there's some color in here, but when I pick this up with my paintbrush, as long as there's no paint in the brush itself, I'm gonna get clear water on my paper. I'm just gonna create just some dots of clear water on my paper on the left here, just like what we did for the wet on wet technique. And then I'm gonna just add some color on top of that. So now I'm gonna add some orange to my brush, or any color that you choose. And I'm going to drop some paint on top of those watered marks that I made earlier. And you'll see, like here and here, because we had a watery layer first, it's going to spread out in different ways. And we can see how the edges are a little bit different based upon where the water is. So here, where I didn't really have a whole lot of water, I've got a hard edge of watercolor paint. Versus down here, where the water has mixed into the paint, I have a softer edge. Here again, in this little section, there's some softer edges happening because there's more water. Here was mostly paint, less water, and so we're getting a lot more of a harder edge. I can do the same thing here just by the same technique that I used for my graded wash. So I'll do the same thing with orange, but on the left here. So if I start off with any shape, I've got a brush bristle stuck in here. If I start off with any shape and add water to that shape on only one side to blend it, you can again see the difference between a hard and a soft edge. This left side here is more paint than water, so we have a very precise hard edge. Adding water on the right hand side is giving me a softer edge. Last one we're going to try for today is scratching, and we're going to do this while it is wet, and then also we're going to let it dry a little bit as well. So I'm just going to switch to a blue, give myself a base layer, now this is where you're going to be using some form of a tool to help you do this. I have these tools accessible. If you don't, you can use a paper clip or anything at home that you would be able to scratch. It needs to have a point though. I would recommend not using a pointed edge that is going to leave some kind of residue on your paper though, like a pencil or a pen. Those have pointed edges, but they're going to leave pencil marks or pen marks on your paper. So we want a pointed edge that's not going to leave any kind of residue on my paper. So I'm scratching into my paper here where I've painted, and you can see that because this is still wet, I'm getting a dark line where I've scratched. Now the next thing we want to try to do is wait until this is almost completely dry, and when we scratch with this tool after it is almost completely dry, then we will get a white edge instead. So depending on the amount of water that's left in our little swatch here, that will determine whether or not we end up with a dark edge or a light edge. And this is something, again, that you could use for like a tree or detailed. And depending on whether or not you want an edge that's colored or an edge that's white, that would determine whether or not you let your paint dry almost completely or you do this technique immediately after applying the paint to the paper. So we're going to pause here and we will wait for a little bit until this is dry enough to start scratching out and get that white edge that we're looking for. As you can see, I added another section over here. Over here, I tried to do the dry technique with the paint and I waited too long. So you have to find the balance here where it's not fully dry, and that's what happened over here. I was trying to scrape from something that was completely dry and I was ruining the paper. So we do want to look for a shimmer on the paper. We want to see that it is still wet, but it should not be so wet that the paint or the water is still moving around if I'm moving my paper. So we're looking for that shine, but we don't want it to be so wet that we still see liquid moving around if we're moving the paper. So at this point, I can indeed pull up some of that pigment, and because it is mostly dry, I'm getting a lighter scratch instead of the darker scratch. So that is our final technique for this video, and in the next video coming up, we will continue with the remaining techniques.